Shalom, welcome to Rob on the Rock. I'm Rob Van Hoff. Today we're going to look at an 11th century arrowhead, as you see here. It's from Phoenicia, and the inscription has the word chetz, arrow, right on it. And we'll look at it in detail. But before we do that, we're going to look at a handful of passages from Scripture where an arrow, chetz also, is used to describe evil speech, the evil tongue, and even we're going to look at Ephesians 6 where Paul uses the image of flaming arrows from the evil one. And we who are in Messiah have the shield of faith by which we're able to block those arrows. Let's take a look. When we find an artifact that has a biblical Hebrew word on it, that really can enlighten our reading of Scripture. And what we're going to look at today is an artifact. It's actually not Israeli, it's actually ancient Phoenician, an arrow that has a name inscribed on it, an arrowhead. And it's got this word chetz on it. So the word chetz, meaning arrow in Hebrew, is not limited to Hebrew. It's also Phoenician. It's a term that had a larger distribution than just biblical Hebrew. And before we look at the image and look at the inscription, I want to look at a few places in the Scriptures where arrows are something we want to beware of because of their power in a metaphorical sense. The first is Jeremiah 9:8. It says, "Their tongue is a deadly arrow," or chetz. Chet tzadi. It speaks deceit. With his mouth one speaks peace to his neighbor, but inwardly he sets an ambush for him. Of course, this is very similar to what Yeshua cites against those who seemingly were religious in his day. He cited the prophet Isaiah saying, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." It's the same problem here in Jeremiah's day, except he's not specifically addressing people's hypocrisy towards God, but towards their neighbor. And he's using the metaphor here of the lashon, of the tongue, as an arrow, a chetz. We'll come back to this after we see the image of the arrow from Phoenicia. Psalm 64:3 and Proverbs 25:8 use chetz in a similar way. Who have sharpened their tongue like a sword. They aimed bitter speech as their arrow. That's this word chetz again in Hebrew. And Proverbs 25:18, like a club and a sword and a sharp arrow, chetz, is a man who bears false witness against his neighbor. And finally, we see, now while it's not in Hebrew, it's in Greek, we have Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, chapter 6. He says, in addition to all, that is the full armor of God that he talks about, taking up the shield of faith, with which you will be able to extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. The arrows of the evil one. So what we've looked at here are passages where, in the Bible, where the idea of evil speech is likened unto the arrow or the chetz. Of course, there are many times where arrows are good. God has arrows, for example, in the Bible. God's people have arrows. David and Jonathan have a communication where Jonathan sends a signal to David by shooting arrows. So arrows are not always in this metaphorical usage. I just selected this on purpose because what I want to show you now is going to be, especially with the tongue, we're going to look at some images here of a arrowhead found in the Lebanon area, and it is dated to 11th century BC. 11th century, so it's between the year roughly 1000 BC and 1100 BC. And it's just about 3.5 inches long. So it's not very long at all. But what's really cool about it is that it has what some would call Paleo-Hebrew, but it's just Phoenician alphabet. And I'll write it out here. As you can see, the image of the tongue, particularly being like an arrow, you can almost see how if someone stuck out their tongue, it might look like this. And what these two images are just the reverse. They just basically flipped it like this. And it reads just like Hebrew does, from right to left, And what we have here is, it's a chet, and I'll go over, and then a tzadi, and then a yod, and then a sheen, then a bet, and an ayin. And what this is, in what we would call in modern Hebrew, is going to be chetz, like this. There's our word chetz, arrow, and we're going to say this is what we call in construct. It's chetz yishba. Chetz yishba. And yishba is taken to be a person's name. Chetz yishba. So this is the arrow of yishba. So in other words, now did this mean he made it himself? I'll translate it in Hebrew, or not Aramaic, what am I thinking? English. Arrow of yishba. Like that. Now, of course, I'm writing from left to right. The word chetz is our first word here, chetz. Chetz yishba. Then we flip the arrow over, and we have what's here at the end. And it has an aleph, another sheen, an ayin, another bet, and then a dalet, another yod, a hey, and then a nun, which looks kind of like this, and then another dalet. And in our Aramaic script, we would say it's aleph, sheen, forgive my sloppiness here, ayin, bet, dalet, yod, hey, nun, dalet. And it's aleph shin is ish, evid yehind, or something like that, yehind, or yichnad. We don't know how to say that last word. And what it seems to mean is a man, servant of Yinad. A man who is a servant of Yinad, something like this. So this is, again, 11th century BC. And it's Phoenician. But if you imagined this tool here, this chetz, this arrow, as 3.5 inches long, and it's flat, right? It's long, it's flat. It's actually like, it could be viewed as what a tongue would look like, a tongue that's stuck out. And if we take that image, that this artifact from 11th century BC is called a chetz, right? We see it right here. Chetz, that's what it is. It's labeled. This artifact is labeled. We go back to our passage from Jeremiah, where he uses the Hebrew chetz, and he says, their tongue is a deadly chetz, arrow, speaking deceit. Again, they aimed their bitter speech as their arrow. And in 25, a sharp arrow is a man who bears false witness against his neighbor. So these are usage of chetz, arrow, in a metaphorical sense, but additionally, not just metaphorical sense, but a metaphorical of evil speech. And finally, like we saw, Ephesians 6:16, of course, is using the Greek language, but it says, in Messiah, we have the shield of faith by which we are able to extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Back to this image, if we think of the arrows of the evil one, boy, that is something serious. That's not something to be taken lightly at all. These would be very significant objects, like when I hear arrow or chetz, something I would pause and see the gravity of the situation, that if the evil one is shooting flaming chitzim, like these arrows, at us, with their evil speech maybe even implied in what is inscribed on them, again with the metaphor, how important it is for us to be armored with the full armor of Messiah Yeshua. I hope this has been a helpful and informative video for you. If you find value with what I'm doing here at Rob on the Rock, please contribute. That's feedback for me to know that I am going to continue creating videos. Again, I don't charge for access to these videos, but I do ask that if you are consistently taking away value, that you would support my work. Thank you very much. Shalom.